A warm welcome to everyone tuning in today. We're diving into a deep and impactful part of world history, the Vietnam War. This was a conflict that spanned 2 decades, from 1955 to 1975, and had lasting effects that can still be felt today. But to truly understand the Vietnam War, we must first venture back to its roots. In the aftermath of World War II, a series of political and military events set the stage for what would become the Vietnam War. At the heart of this was the struggle against French colonial rule. Vietnam, a nation with a rich history and culture, had been under the control of the French for nearly a century. The end of World War II sparked a wave of anti-colonial sentiment across the globe, and Vietnam was no exception. The Vietnamese people, led by the charismatic revolutionary leader Ho Chi Minh, began to rise up against their colonial overlords. This led to the First Indochina War, a bitter conflict that would last for 8 long years. And it was this struggle, this fight for independence, that would sow the seeds of the Vietnam War. As the dust settled on the First Indochina War in 1954, Vietnam found itself divided into 2 separate entities, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North Vietnam was led by Ho Chi Minh and his communist government, while South Vietnam was backed by the United States and other anti-communist allies. This division set the stage for a larger conflict, one that would come to define a generation and change the course of history. The Vietnam War was not just a civil war, but a major conflict of the Cold War era. It was a war of ideologies, a clash between the Communist North, supported by the Soviet Union and China, and the capitalist South, backed by the United States and its allies. But as we'll see, it was also a war that had profound human costs and far-reaching consequences. Remember to subscribe and share our content if you find it enlightening. Stay with us as we delve into the escalation of the conflict. As we continue our journey, we now take a look at the escalating tensions that led to full-blown war. The year is 1955, and the seeds of conflict have been sown in the soil of Vietnam. North and South Vietnam, 2 halves of a divided nation, supported by opposing global powers. The North, backed by the Soviets and China, while the South received aid from the United States and other anti-communist allies. As the years rolled on, the conflict gradually intensified. The United States, driven by the domino theory and the fear of communism spreading throughout Southeast Asia, began to increase their involvement. They provided military advisors, financial aid, and equipment to bolster the South Vietnamese. Yet the situation on the ground remained volatile, and the threat of full-scale war loomed ever closer. Then in 1964, an event occurred that would irrevocably change the course of the conflict, known as the Gulf of Tonkin Incident. It was a series of perceived attacks by North Vietnamese forces on US Navy destroyers. Whether these attacks were provoked or even occurred at all remains a topic of heated debate. Nonetheless, the incident was used as a justification by the US government to ramp up their military involvement in Vietnam. This marked a significant turning point in the war. The United States Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting President Lyndon B. Johnson the authority to use military force to defend South Vietnam. This was not a formal declaration of war, but it effectively opened the floodgates for US troops to be sent into Vietnam. The stage was set for a conflict that would last for almost a decade, changing the lives of millions of people. The Vietnam War was now at its peak, with the US deeply involved. As the calendar pages turned from the mid to the late 1960s, the intensity of the conflict escalated dramatically. The US, under the leadership of Presidents Johnson and Nixon, was deeply entrenched in a war that was thousands of miles away from its shores. The year 1965 marked a significant escalation, with the US deploying ground combat units for the first time. The battles were fierce, intense, and unrelenting, taking place in jungles, villages, and cities across Vietnam. Among the most notable was the Tet Offensive in 1968, a coordinated series of attacks by the North Vietnamese that caught the US and its allies by surprise. Despite being a military defeat for the North, the Tet Offensive had a profound impact on American public opinion, fueling anti-war sentiment back home. Indeed, as the war waged on, opposition to the war grew stronger within the US. The anti-war movement was a diverse collection of individuals and groups, students, veterans, pacifists, and intellectuals, among others. They held protests, sit-ins, and teach-ins, challenging the government's war policies and calling for an end to the conflict. The war was being fought not just in the jungles of Vietnam, but in the streets and campuses of America as well. By the early 1970s, the US began to seek a way out. The Nixon administration initiated a policy of Vietnamization, aiming to gradually withdraw US troops while bolstering South Vietnam's ability to fight the war. In 1973, after a series of complex negotiations in Paris, a ceasefire was agreed upon, and the last US combat troops left Vietnam. But even as the US extricated itself from the conflict, the war was far from over. The struggle between North and South Vietnam would continue, with devastating consequences for the people of Vietnam. The US was out, but the war was far from over. Despite the withdrawal of US forces, the war raged on, with an end that shocked the world. The pivotal years from 1973 to 1975 marked the final chapter of this tumultuous conflict. With the United States military involvement coming to a close, the North and South were left to their own devices, yet peace was still a distant dream. The North, bolstered by support from the Soviet Union and China, waged a relentless campaign against the South. The climax of this phase was the fall of Saigon in April of 1975. This event, as harrowing as it was iconic, marked the end of the Vietnam War. Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, fell into the hands of the North, signaling a decisive victory for the communist forces. But the end of the war did not mean the end of its impact. In its wake, the war left a unified Vietnam, yes, but one that was deeply scarred by 2 decades of conflict. The nation was devastated, its people traumatized, and its economy in ruins. The war had claimed the lives of millions of Vietnamese soldiers and civilians alike. The human cost was staggering, and the emotional toll immeasurable. Beyond the human casualties, the war also had far-reaching effects on the environment. The extensive use of toxic herbicides resulted in significant ecological damage, with effects that lingered long after the last bullet was fired. The aftermath of the war also saw a mass exodus of refugees. Millions were displaced, forced to seek new homes, new lives far from the land they once called home. The refugee crisis was a stark reminder of the far-reaching implications of war, a sobering testament to its destructive power. And so ended a conflict that left deep scars on the nations involved, scars that are still healing today. This war, known by many names, will forever be etched in the annals of history, not just as a military conflict, but as a poignant reminder of the cost of war and the enduring human spirit that emerges from its ashes. The Vietnam War was a complex and devastating conflict that spanned 2 decades. From its origins in resistance to French colonial rule, it escalated into a major Cold War conflict, drawing in superpowers and dividing nations. At its height, the United States' involvement was significant, shaping the course of the war and its eventual end. The war's aftermath was felt long after the last shots were fired, with lasting effects on the people and the land. This conflict, with its profound global implications, serves as a stark reminder of the cost of war. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning.